Hey there everybody, it's Missy Whidden and I am very excited to be a guest teacher here at Scrap Academy. And today I wanted to go through in real time and talk to you a little bit about gesso. If you follow any type of mixed media scrapbookers, then I'm sure you've heard about gesso and what it does and what it can do for your projects, but maybe you're not quite sure what it is or why you may or may not need it. I'm a huge fan of gesso. I pretty much do mixed media on all of my layouts. It's my favorite thing to do. And so I thought I would kind of start from the beginning and show you what I use on my projects and why I prefer certain gessos on certain papers and just kind of what I use with it and the effects you can get with it. These are the three main gessos that I use: Liquitex and Finnabair Art Basics. The white gesso that I use is this one. This is the only white gesso I've ever used, and there are a lot of different brands out there. I just have not tried all of them. This is the one that works for me, and I'm going to talk about and show you when I use the white and why I use the white. Now these two are clear, so that means when they go on the paper they dry clear and you can't even tell that it's there. The difference, this is the one that I used to use all the time, and I still do occasionally, from Liquitex. This one dries kind of sandy and gritty, whereas this one that I've just recently discovered a few months ago from Art Basics is smooth. And I prefer this one. But this one still works great. It gives you some interesting textures. So I'm going to kind of show you how I use these and what they can do. So I've taken a sheet of thick, smooth white cardstock. This is the Marshmallow from Basil. This is my favorite go-to background cardstock that I use. And you can see it's pretty thick. And I've divided up into half here. So I'm going to show you gesso and what a couple of things look like with the gesso versus no gesso, because I tend to get a lot of questions, you know, do I have to use gesso? And the answer is no. It just depends on the look that you want to get with your finished products, whether you're using sprays or ink pads or gelatos or watercolors, whatever that may be. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you white cardstock. I'm also going to show you when I use gesso on colored cardstock and pattern paper, and I just have some scrap papers here that I'm going to demonstrate on. So first and foremost, this is what I use the most. Now when I have white cardstock, I like to use the clear gesso, and the reason behind that is, for some reason, like I said, this is the only one I've ever used, but when it dries, it's a little bit more on the yellow side compared to the white of the paper, so it looks a little bit yellow. Now when you use the white on, say, one of these papers, it doesn't really look yellow because you're not really comparing it to this stark white paper. And so sometimes you can see the difference in where the gesso starts and where the paper is. So I prefer to go with clear. And so for this demonstration, I'm going to use my favorite gesso here. Now, some gessos come in a tube, some of them come in like a little container with a lid. It doesn't really matter. And I like to scrape it on using this brush here. I've just recently started using this the last couple of months. It's called Barvati. I got this on Amazon. You can find them on Amazon, and they come in different sizes, but it's basically just a silicone end here, so there's no bristles, so it's easy to smooth things on and easy to clean up, which clearly I'm not that great at cleaning up. Yeah, I'm a messy girl, what can I say? So I'm going to scrape it on with this. Now if you don't have a fancy brush like this, you don't need it. You can actually use like an old gift card or a piece of cardboard or just something with a smooth edge that you can scrape with. Okay, so I'm going to coat this side with the gesso, and then I'm going to leave the right side blank. I'm going to make a mess here, so get ready. Okay, it's what I do best, is make messes. Okay, so I just get a little bit on there, and then Just kind of smooth it on. And it usually doesn't take too long for this to dry, but you do want to wait until it is completely dry before you start adding things onto it. Otherwise, it's just going to turn into a clumpy mess, and you're not going to get the effects that you want on your page. So I'm going to smooth this down, and see, you can't see it, it's clear. Okay? Now what this does, let me tell you what gesso is. That would be important to know, right? Okay, what gesso really is a primer. You know, kind of like when you're going to paint your walls in your house, you put a primer on first. Well, I guess maybe some paints nowadays you don't have to do that, but so you have the paper, and then you have, say, a spray ink like this. So this is basically liquid, right? Okay, you know what happens when liquid hits paper. If you use a lot of it, it's going to warp the paper, it's going to start to tear holes in it. Now if you just did a little squirt, it's not a big deal. However, if you want to have, you know, a lot of color and you're using a lot of spray or a lot of watercolor, you want to be able to have that color kind of spread and blend and look like watercolor. And if you don't want it to just soak right through the paper, the gesso is what is sort of it's a barrier between all that water and the cardstock. And it's going to allow all the color to sit on top of it for a little bit for it to run and blend before it dries. Versus if you were just to spray it directly onto the no gesso side, it's just going to soak right through, and that's what it's going to look like. So you can see here that the gesso does start to warp the paper a little bit. Not a big deal. You have to kind of expect that to happen because this is just paper, you know. This is not watercolor paper. And you could get different effects if you use watercolor paper, but in most scrapbooking, I don't. I just use regular cardstock. So you can kind of see here, it's going to warp just a little bit, but never fear, there's always a way to flatten it out if you don't like the warping. I like to let everything dry, and then I have a couple of big paper pads that are pretty heavy, that are 12 by 12, and I will lay that on top of it when it's dry, and that pretty much does a good job of flattening it all out. Alright, so I'm going to let this dry, and then we will come back in just a few minutes, and I'm going to show you what's going to happen. Okay, so this is dry, and remember this side has nothing on it, it's just plain paper. So I'm going to start with a few things that I use frequently, which are spray inks. Now there are lots of brands of spray inks. My favorite are shimmers, and this is one of my favorite colors of all time. It's called Jenny B. Blue, and here's the difference in gesso versus no gesso. Okay. Spray it down, and you can see it looks like it's starting to pool up. That's because it's not soaking right through the paper. Now I'm going to spray it on the no gesso side. Okay, you can already see a little bit of difference here where it's pooling up. Now what I like to do is take a brush and just help move it around the paper. You can kind of see here how the gesso allows me to do that. And if I decide, that's too much, I can dab some of it up, and it really isn't that noticeable. The gesso is protecting the paper. So over here, nothing. When I do the same thing, it lets it spread a little bit, but primarily it has soaked through the paper. You can see here where it's splattered out. Like, I can't really do anything with that. It's going to stay right where it is, which is fine. It's just a different effect. Now if I wanted to dab some of this up, it's not going to come up as easy. You can see where I spread it. You see it's basically stayed in the exact same shape it is, which this is also very pretty. It's just very different. So if I want to blend, let's say I want to blend two colors together. Okay, I'm going to come back, spray that, and then spray a different blue. I'm able to add a little bit of water and then let the colors kind of run all over the place. I love to do this technique. The gesso just allows for you to experiment longer, and it allows for the blending of color, and the paper is just not going to rip or tear, and you get this really pretty effect. And you can manipulate this, because it takes me a long time usually to get my backgrounds done, because I'll see a spot where I want to change it, or I want to use my brush to kind of fade it out on the edges. It just depends on the look that you're going for. But I love doing this technique. Now if I'm going to come back over here to this side and do the same thing, it will still work, just not to the same effect. Okay, let's go ahead and dab up this side here so I can move around a little bit. But it's going to start to, whoop, we're crossing lines here. That's okay, the gesso allows me to do that. So if I start to let the colors drip and say, oh, I didn't really want to do that on the gesso side, I can dab it up a little bit. Over here, not so much. You see how you can see the streak there. So it just gives, it's just more forgiving, whereas the no gesso, it just makes it harder to blend, and you can kind of see the difference up close. Over time, this side you're going to start to get some seepage through, whereas this side you can go a lot more. I can add a lot more water. Let's see, use my little spray bottle here. I can add a lot more water over here versus over here it's going to start to soak through. And again, whoops, things are falling apart here. I can dab this up. Let me get another napkin. I can dab this up, pretend like that didn't even happen. Whereas this side, wherever it goes, it's going to leave a little bit of a mark there. And the effects of this are definitely different on textured cardstock. This is pretty thick cardstock, and the no gesso does work better on this thick cardstock. If I were to do the same thing on this cardstock with the texture, which I'll show you in a minute, you're going to get different effects. But normally I wouldn't dab all this up. I just wanted to show you the difference in the gesso acting as a layer between the paper. So another thing that I like to do, gelatos. If you have gelatos, these are basically like little lipsticks. That's what they remind me of. But you don't want to put these on your lips. These are designed basically to scribble on like so. And you can use these with or without gesso, but the difference is if you use these on gesso, you can activate these with water, turn this into a watercolor, and it instantly gives you the same effect as the spray that I just used. And on the no gesso, still works, but you can still see the initial scribble where I made the marks. And it's kind of hard to get rid of that. Whereas on this one, you just get more of a blending effect. Whereas this side, whenever it hits the paper, that's kind of the shape that you wind up getting. So not too much of a difference, but over here, see what I mean? You still see where I scribbled it down, whereas over here, you really don't. Another technique is stamping. I'm going to show you. This is a technique I've recently just started doing, and it's so much fun. And this is a Distress Oxide. Just going to stamp a few times. Now, Distress Oxides are so much fun because they react really well with water, whether you use gesso or not. So on the gesso side, this is what I like to do. I like to stamp it down and then blur the edges a little bit with some water to make it look like it was left out in the rain. And this is just a quick sample. I mean, you could do this with any type of stamp. You could just blur the inside. Don't be afraid to use your fingers also to give it a little smudge. You see how easy this is with the gesso. And if I wanted to completely erase it, you can just completely erase it because it hasn't soaked through the paper. But yeah, this is a fun technique to do. Gives you that spreading, bleeding color look. Over here, it's probably going to work a little bit of the same way, but look what happens. It's already soaked through the paper. Even though the color is bleeding a little bit, you're still getting that crisp stamped image that's already soaked through and stained the paper. See the difference there? Whereas this side, I can completely almost dissolve it. And now the longer it sits, the longer it is going to dry. So over time, this will happen over here. It's just not as strong as this. So yeah, just depends on the look you're going for. And then also over time, like the edges of the paint will dry. And see now, I get this look. I can't even smudge what I just, see how it's stuck there. Can't really do anything with it. Whereas over here, I can come back and continue to spread the color of the edges a little bit better. And even later, let's say I wanted to come back up here and add more, oops, already got the lid off, add more up here. I can still do that because the gesso is still there. I can still add layer upon layer upon layer, work with the coloring, add more water, continue to let it run and spread. Whereas over here, can still do it, but with all that extra layering, you know, the paper is going to start to tear. And I don't want to turn the paper over because all this liquid is going to go everywhere. But kind of get the little bit of a difference there. You just get more of this faded look, more of this raw watercolor artsy look. Whereas with the no gesso, you're going to get more defined edges, whereas like where you spray it right down, it's going to look more like that shape. Whereas over here, you're able to move it around and manipulate it and let it run and just change and kind of get to where you want it to go. So I hope some of that makes sense. So you can definitely get away with doing mixed media without gesso. I just prefer to use it because I like that it's forgiving. I like that it allows me to blend and smudge and pretty much with any of the products that I used here, you know, and this will work with regular watercolors in the little pans or the containers that you can buy for, you know, $3 or $4 at the craft store. It works with stamp inks. It works with gelatos. You can do this with acrylic paint as well. You can water it down and use it as a watercolor. So that's just kind of a general overview of clear gesso on white paper and just some of the things that you can do with it. And of course this is wet, so it's going to take a little bit of time to dry. So yeah, just because you don't have gesso doesn't mean you can't do mixed media. You're just going to get different effects. Alright, so now I'm going to show you white gesso. So this is a very loud color, pretty much kind of a coral, bright coral color. Now if I was to use this clear gesso right on top of this, it's going to dry clear, and you can still add your color to it, which is fine. I tend to like to create what I call white space, even though I'm using a colored paper. So that's where I use the white. And a lot of people don't like this look, and it's just a personal preference, you know. And I'm going to kind of do the same thing that I just did. I'm going to show you how I do the white. I'm going to use the same thing, the same technique. And it's still the same thing as the clear. It's a primer, so it's going to protect the paper. And this is textured. So I'm going to add a little bit of white on this side, and it's going to look white. So you got to work quick with the white gesso, because you see how it looks when I scrape it down? When it dries, that's exactly how it's going to look. So if you don't want it to look brush strokey like this, I like to use my finger and do a quick smudge to make it look kind of cloudy and hazy around the edges. And you got to be quick, because it's going to dry and it's going to be very visible because of the dark color of the background. So I always am a fan of using your hands to smudge. And if it looks messed up, for lack of a better term, don't worry about it, because you're going to add color on top of it. That's the whole point of adding the gesso, right? So once you've decided where your picture's going to go or where your papers are going to go, you can smudge a little down, use your hands. And the cool thing about using the white on textured cardstock is you get the texture of the cardstock showing through. You can instantly see this fun texture, which is another awesome layer of doing mixed media. I love making texture. And when you use textured cardstock, it gives you instant texture. So yeah, this looks like a big splotchy white mess, but what it's doing is it's giving me a little bit of white space, and it's protecting the paper. And it is going to warp a little bit. I don't know if you can see that. It's not too bad. I'm not adding a whole lot of it. So let's say I was going to use this as a background, and let me find a picture. Okay, here's a black and white picture. Let's just say, this is a picture of my daughter sucking her thumb, sleeping. Let's say I was going to use this as a background, and I was going to use this photo over here. Okay, maybe I'd want a little more gesso here to show. And this is drying really fast because I'm scraping it on really thin. And you can add as much as you want. If you want it to be super white, you can do that. If you want it to be just a little bit, you can just add a little bit. You know, you're in control of this. So that's the beauty of this whole hobby, is there's no right or wrong way to do it. And this is just the way I do it. Okay, so this is probably not the most accurate way, but this is the way I do it. This is the way it works for me. So, and this is still a little bit wet, but it's going to dry here in just a few minutes because it's scraped on pretty thin. Now this looks messy, I know. Some people are like, whoa, that's just a bunch of white on this cardstock. So if I was to use the clear, whenever I go to spray a color onto this paper, it's going to look like a different color because of the background color. So if I was to spray this pink on the white paper, it would look exactly this pink. But if I'm to spray this pink onto this paper, it's going to look different because this is not white. So this kind of gives me a little bit of white space. So now when I go to spray this pink color, it's going to look this pink color. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do is, let me see, I'm going to grab a couple of colors here that would go with this. If I'm going to do, say, a pink and coral color background. Almost dry. So let me show you what I'm talking about in the meantime. So this is definitely not going to be a background that I would use. I'm going to use this as a demo sheet. So over here, there's no gesso. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm almost out of this color. So this is pretty much a bright pink color. It's called Sweetheart. If I'm going to spray it on top of the cardstock here, it's instantly soaking through the paper, okay? Now, I can do a little bit of what I was doing earlier. I can use my brush and to kind of spread it around. But it's going to start to soak through the paper. You see how different that color looks? I know my lights are really bright. Hopefully you can still see that. There we go. Now, if I'm going to spray it over here on the white space, it looks exactly like the color in here. So you get a little bit of difference. You see the difference in the colors there? Same color in the bottle looks totally different over here versus here. And now I'm able to do what I was able to do on the other sheet. I can add water, I can spread it around. You see all these where it's sprayed out? If I did not want that effect, just get some water and work with it and blur it out. It just gives you a little bit of white area, and if you want to blend another color in there with it, maybe even a little bit of this coral color here. Whoop, this one isn't spraying very straight. That's okay. You can add a little bit of water. You can add a lot of water. But you just get this whole ability to let it run and flow on the background. And if I keep it where the gesso is, it's going to still allow me to do that. But the cool thing about using the textured cardstock is you get the texture showing through. I don't know if you can see this, but you get the little squares of the texture of the cardstock. I know my lights are hard there with the reflection, but you guys have seen textured cardstock, so you know. But if I was to try to do all this same stuff over here, can still do it. Whoops, now this bottle is dripping. That's not cool. To fix that. That'll come in another video. You can get the same effect, and you can see my paper's already starting to warp over here. You can still do the same thing. It's just going to give you a different look. Colors are going to look different. You see how this looks like a completely different color than it was when I sprayed it over here. Ooh, now it's dripping everywhere. And I can blend it all together. And you just get a different look. It's just a totally different look. I like the faded hazy look versus this harsh edge look like around here. I love how the gesso allows you to get this nice faded lighter look around the edges. And I'm just mesmerized by watching the colors run and blend together. Just think that's so cool. And then when you're done, you know, you're ready to add your, let's see here, if you're ready to add your photo, it just changes the whole look of the background when you start to add things back on top of it. I know a lot of people message me and say, oh, this background is so ugly, blah, I'm going to chunk it in the trash. I'm like, no, wait. It looks like a hot mess now, but when you put your photo on top of it, it starts to shift and change, you know, and then you're going to add some patterned paper. You're probably going to add some stickers or a cup file or something, and it's going to change the effect of the whole thing once you start to add. So sometimes it looks like way too much, but when you start to put things on top of it, it may not be enough, you know. You may have to go back and add some more. You never know. So naturally things are gonna pull up like this because the paper is starting to warp a little bit. So that's when you want to work with it, and you just have to kind of manipulate it. I like to just turn the paper all different directions and watch it run and spread and blend, you know. And you probably need to dab a bit of it up here and there. And you do have to be patient and let it dry, because sometimes it dries lighter than it went when you sprayed it on. But you see the difference here and how this looks with the gesso versus not gesso. And I happen to like the look of this messy white hazy look around the edges. I know some people tend to not like that. I do, you know, I don't know. I just think it adds to the whole artsy look of it. And if I was to just use this as my background, it's fine. Nothing wrong with using just the cardstock. But you see these edges? They're going to stay that way. And the more water you add to it, the more it's going to start to just turn into a wet, soggy mess. But that's just kind of the difference in the gesso. So if I use a colored cardstock, I like to use the white. I've never actually used clear because I like to create this white space to keep the colors that I'm going to use true to themselves versus having them look totally different because of the color. Alright, so one more thing here. If I'm going to do a background like this, a crazy pattern, or even something like that, I tend to go with white. So let's say I'm going to use this same thing here. Now to me, this background is super busy, and when I look at it, my eyes start going, woo. So I want to white out some of this. Let's just say I want to white out an area behind where the photo is going to go. That is where I'll pull out the white again, because the clear won't cover it up. The clear is going to dry clear, right? So I'm going to use white, and this pattern is pretty bold and pretty busy, so I'm probably going to have to use plenty of gesso, and it depends on how thick. But you can see here it's starting to fade out some of the pattern, and that's exactly what I want. Because sometimes when you use a busy pattern paper like this, it kind of distracts, is that the right word? It takes away from your photo. Especially if you have a color photo that's got a lot going on, like a busy photo, and you're going to use a busy background. It's almost like, where's the photo? Everything's so busy, I can't see it. So by giving yourself a little bit of white space amongst this busy pattern, it's going to help the focus to kind of hone in on your photo and separate it from all of this busy stuff. So sometimes I like to get crazy and use a busy background like this. But if I do, that's where the white gesso is going to come in handy, because it's going to give me a little bit of space to separate the photo from all this busy stuff. Sometimes I go crazy and I'll cover almost all of it and just leave the pattern showing around with a little bit of this showing through, which is another cool effect to do. So what I'm going to do when I'm finished with all of this is flip up some examples of some pages showing you all of these techniques. Okay, so you can see here that I've got myself a little white space, and then you can still see some of the pattern. It's just muted, you know, it's just a little less busy. So it gives me some space for my photo to rest. And I probably would continue to add more, but I don't want to use up all of my gesso. So yeah, you kind of see the difference there. It's going to help the photo to stand out, and you would probably add layers of some paper or something behind this. But yeah, I'm able to have a little bit of white space here, and then I could go in, you know, and add a color behind it if I wanted to. And again, the paper's protected. And I still use regular pattern paper like this, and this is from Simple Stories. So this is just a regular, you know, it's not thick at all. It's really not meant for lots of sprays, but you can do it if you add the gesso, and you just have to be careful and not add so much to where it starts to tear your paper. And look at me making a mess. That's what I do, right? Gesso would cover that up. Yes, Gesso answers a lot of questions and solves a lot of problems for me in my scrapbooking life. So you kind of get the idea there. Now, these are the main ways that I use Gesso and what I use it for. The main products I use are, like I said, the shimmer sprays. I use Distress Oxides a lot. I use ink pads like this. This is just a regular ink pad. I have a lot that I use from Pink Fresh Studio. Gelatos I use a lot, and sometimes just plain watercolor. So you don't have to have fancy things to do mixed media, you know. But the Gesso does play a big part in my scrapbooking. And yeah, so I'm going to kind of flip up some examples and show you when I used white Gesso versus when I used clear Gesso, and on different kinds of paper. So I hope this is giving you some explanation of Gesso and how it works and what it does. So here's an example of when I used clear Gesso on top of thick, smooth white cardstock. This is a light colored pattern paper that I used white Gesso on. This was cardstock where I used white Gesso and modeling paste. Pattern paper with white Gesso and inks. Purple cardstock, you can see where I used the white Gesso in the background. Another colored cardstock where I used white Gesso first before adding spray inks. Another example, white Gesso on colored cardstock. This is where I used white Gesso on top of pattern paper, you can see there. White cardstock, clear Gesso. Colored cardstock, oh no, pattern paper, sorry, with white Gesso and modeling paste. Pattern paper with white Gesso to fade out some of those stripes. Pattern paper with white Gesso. So that's just some examples. You can go back and pause on those if you want to see them longer. And I decided to do a background here fresh for this video. And I want to recreate this beautiful paper from the new Paige Evans Go the Scenic Route collection. Or not recreate it, but it just inspired me to try to do some colorful squares on a background. So I'm going to use thick, smooth white cardstock for this with the clear Gesso, the smooth clear Gesso from Art Basics. I let it dry. And then I pulled out my Distress Oxides. And I'm going to basically just stamp each one right onto the background, kind of press it down and then smudge it a little bit. If you've ever used Distress Oxides, then you know a little bit of color goes a long way, because once I start to add water to this later, the color is just going to bloom. So I am just going across the top there, smushing down each color, and I just couldn't decide on a color scheme, so I went with rainbow. I pulled out all the colors. And I'll give you a list of all the colors that I'm using here. Candied Apple, Abandoned Coral, Festive Berries, Picked Raspberry, Seedless Preserves, Spiced Marmalade, Ripe Persimmon, Fossilized Amber, Evergreen Bough, Lucky Clover, Broken China, Salty Ocean, Mermaid Lagoon, Peacock Feathers, Chipped Sapphire, and Faded Jeans. And now that I've got all that stamped, watch what happens when I start to add water. I'm just using a brush. My glass of water is off camera, but it's right there above my page. And yeah, it's magic. These Distress Oxides make it so easy. And this background is very easy to make. I'm telling you, anybody can do this. If you're willing to have the patience to add the Gesso, let it dry, you can do this in a matter of minutes. This really did not take a long time, but the ink and the color and the water just do all the work for you. And the Gesso makes all this spreading possible, because we talked about that earlier when I was showing you everything about the Gesso. You know, it just allows everything to kind of stay on top of the paper for a while instead of just soaking through. And it allows for this beautiful blending and spreading of the colors. And so this doesn't look exactly like that Paige Evans paper, but it just inspired me to try to do this. And I really like how this turned out. And even though some of the colors are beside colors that don't really blend together, I was very careful, like right there where the pink and the green, you definitely don't want to mix pink and green. So I was careful to try not to blend those two together to create an ugly color, or you know, just a color that didn't look nice. But yeah, this is easy. You just add your water. You can dab up some if you don't want it, or if it's too much. I think this is really cool, especially if you like artsy watercolor effects on your backgrounds, then highly suggest doing this. And this is more of a controlled mixed media. You know, you can control how much water you add, you can control how much ink you add. You could do this with a stamp, like when I did in the demonstration earlier with that flower stamp. Same idea. I just stamped the actual ink pad onto the paper. So this is fun to make, and I hope you guys will give this a try, because it's a lot of fun to do. And it takes more time to dry than it did to actually make it. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire process of all my embellishments and everything for this layout, because this video is super long. I mainly just wanted to show you the background and just another idea of how you could make a background, and show you what gesso will allow you to do and the freedom that it gives you when it comes to adding water and color and things like that. But look at this background. That took me really no time at all. I think it looks really cool. I have a black and white photo that I'm going to use here, and I don't want to cover up all that background, so I'm going to put the photo kind of down, kind of overlapping the bottom strip. And I thought that I would kind of bring down the blues to kind of go behind where the photo is going to go. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to stamp it and scrape it a little bit more and bring those colors down, and it's going to be able to kind of peek around the edges of the photo. And I have to remember, I'm going to tuck some things in, add some embellishments, add some thread, my title, and some things like that. And I wind up just using some bits and pieces from my stash. I didn't really pull out a collection or anything to use with this, but yeah, again, you can see what the gesso is allowing me to do. It's allowing the color to thin out and run and blend and really mix well with the water. And any part of it that I don't like, I can dab it up, and it's almost like it wasn't there. But yeah, and it dries really pretty. You just get these really pretty faded edges. Yeah, I cannot sing the praises of gesso enough. I absolutely love what it can do for your mixed media projects and all of the different products that are out there to use for mixed media. So you can see there, I like to make my background area and then bring my photo back on top of it to see how it looks, because right now it looks like there's a ton down there. But when the photo comes back on top of it, since it's a pretty big photo, you know, a lot of it gets covered up. So I want to make sure that I can see it around the edges. So there is what I have so far. I think this turned out really cool. It looks messy, it looks artsy, it looks imperfect, but I love it. So that's the background. And then I'm going to jump right to the final photo there. You can see I did some stamping on the background. I added in some pieces from Dear Lizzie. My title, that lovely, is from Cocoa Vanilla Studio. I used some Carrie Bradford stamps. But here are the close-ups of this background. I hope you guys will try this, because it really is easy to do, and you could do this with any color scheme. You could do this with any ink pads if you use the gesso. You know, the gesso will allow anything to pretty much react with water, and it's just very forgiving, and it allows for some really pretty effects. And I hope I answered some of your questions concerning gesso and the different kinds and the different things that you can use it for. And there are probably a ton more things. These are just the things that I've experienced and the things that I use in my scrapbooking on a regular basis. So please let me know if you guys have any questions at all. And thank you so much for you guys for having me here at Scrap Academy. I'll see you next time.